In the archives of American folklore, there are thousands of ghost stories. Most of them are vague: a cold spot in a hallway, a fleeting shadow in a window, or a feeling of unease that can easily be dismissed as imagination. But there is one case that defies dismissal. It stands alone because of the sheer volume of witnesses, the duration of the haunting, and the violence of its conclusion. It is the haunting of the Bell family in Adams, Tennessee. To understand why this case is so disturbing, we must look at the status of the victims. John Bell was not a superstitious recluse living on the fringes of society. He was a wealthy farmer, a church deacon, and a man of immense respect in his community. He owned over 300 acres of land along the Red River. He was a rational, hard-headed man who did not believe in ghosts. But between 1817 and 1821, something entered his home that broke him, physically and mentally. The events began in the late summer of 1817, not inside the house, but in the cornfields. John Bell was walking through his rows of corn when he saw an animal sitting in the middle of a row. He described it as having the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. It was a biological absurdity. Bell, being a pragmatic man, raised his gun and fired. The creature vanished instantly, leaving no blood and no tracks. Days later, Bell's son, Drew, approached the house and saw a massive bird perched on the fence. He described it as being of extraordinary size, larger than a turkey, unknown to the region. When he approached it, the bird flapped its wings and rose slowly, but instead of flying away, it hovered, staring at him with an intelligence that unnerved him. These were the warning shots. The invasion was moving closer to the house. By September, the activity moved inside. It started as sound. Every night, precisely after the family blew out the candles, the noises would begin. At first, it sounded like a single rat, gnawing on the bedpost. John Bell searched the room, tore apart the beds, and set traps. He found nothing, but the gnawing continued, growing louder every night. Soon, the gnawing evolved. It turned into the sound of scratching, heavy, frantic scratching, as if a dog were trying to dig through the floorboards from underneath the house. Then came the sound of chains, the distinct metallic clanking of heavy iron chains being dragged across the wooden floors of the hallway. The family could hear the weight of the metal, the friction of the iron against the wood, moving from room to room. But sound can be ignored. Violence cannot. In late 1817, the entity, which had not yet spoken or named itself, made physical contact. The primary targets were John Bell and his youngest daughter, Betsy. Betsy would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She claimed that something cold was grabbing her hair and pulling her out of bed. When her parents lit the candles, they saw the physical evidence. Betsy's hair was disheveled, pulled tight, and there were red handprints appearing on her face. She was being slapped by invisible hands. The attacks on John Bell were different. They were internal. He began to complain of a feeling of a stick being stuck sideways in his throat. His tongue would swell to the point where he couldn't eat. The entity seemed to have a specific vendetta against the patriarch of the family. For months, the Bells suffered in silence. They were terrified that if they spoke about what was happening, the community would brand them as insane or cursed. They tried to keep the secret within the walls of their log cabin, but the entity refused to be a secret. It wanted an audience. The breaking point came when the activity became so loud that the family could no longer sleep. John Bell finally confided in his neighbor and best friend, James Johnston. Johnston was a skeptic. He told Bell that there must be a natural explanation, a prankster, a loose shutter, animals in the walls. He offered to spend the night at the Bell home to expose the fraud. Johnston and his wife arrived at the Bell farm. They held a prayer service and went to bed. For a few hours, the house was silent. Then, the covers on their bed were ripped off. Johnston sat up, demanding to know who was there. In response, he felt a sharp, stinging blow to his cheek. He had been slapped. Johnston leaped out of bed, lit a candle, and shouted, "In the name of the Lord, who are you, and what do you want?" There was no answer, but the violence ceased for the moment. The next morning, a shaken James Johnston left the house. He went straight to the town of Adams and told everyone what he had seen. He said, "I do not know what it is, but it is not of this world." The secret was out. The isolation was over. And now that the entity had the attention of the public, it was about to evolve. It was done scratching. It was ready to speak. By 1818, the haunting of the Bell family had evolved. It was no longer a secret kept behind closed doors. The entire Robertson County knew that something unholy had taken residence in the Bell home. But the phenomenon was about to shift from a poltergeist and noisy ghost to something far more rare and terrifying. An intelligent, interactive entity. It began with whistling. When the family would sit by the fire in the evenings, trying to ignore the scratching in the walls, they would hear a low, melodic whistling. It wasn't random wind, it was a tune. If one of the Bell sons whistled a song, the entity would whistle it back, note for note. If they tapped a rhythm on the table, the entity would tap it back on the ceiling. It was mimicking them. It was learning. Then, the whistling turned into whispering. At first, it was unintelligible, soft, guttural muttering that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. But day by day, the articulation improved. The entity was practicing. It was learning the cadence of human speech. And then, one night, it spoke clearly. The voice was described as distinct. It wasn't the voice of a monster. It was the voice of an old woman, raspy and sharp, but intelligent. It didn't just scream, it conversed. It could quote scripture from the Bible better than the local preacher. It knew the gossip of the town. It knew what neighbors 3 miles away were doing at that exact moment. When John Bell asked the entity who it was, it gave different answers at different times. Once, it claimed to be the spirit of a Native American whose grave had been disturbed. Another time, it claimed to be a spirit from hell. But the identity that stuck the name that would go down in history was Kate, the entity claimed. I am the spirit of old Kate Batts, and I am determined to haunt John Bell to his grave. This revelation grounded the horror in a very real, human conflict. Kate Batts was a neighbor of the Bells. She was an eccentric, often difficult woman who had engaged in a business dispute with John Bell over the purchase of some slaves. She believed Bell had cheated her. On her deathbed, she had sworn vengeance. Now, it seemed, she had returned to collect the debt. The entity, now called Kate by the family and the locals, became a permanent fixture in the house. She was not always violent. In a twist of psychological torture, she could be kind. She would sing hymns to Mrs. Bell, whom she claimed to love. She would bring fresh fruit to the children. But the moment John Bell entered the room, the mood shifted. She would curse him with a vocabulary so vile, it shocked the men of the community. She would vow to kill him. She was dismantling him, piece by piece. News of the talking spirit spread beyond Tennessee. It traveled up the rivers and down the wagon roads, eventually reaching Nashville. It reached the ears of a man who was arguably the toughest human being in America at the time, Major General Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a war hero. He was the victor of the Battle of New Orleans. He was known as Old Hickory because he was as tough as wood. He had fought duels, carried bullets in his body, and commanded armies. He was not a man who believed in fairy tales. When he heard about the Bell Witch, he didn't feel fear. He felt curiosity, and perhaps a bit of skepticism. He decided to see it for himself. Jackson assembled a team. He took a wagon train, supplies, and a group of his toughest men. They set out from Nashville to Adams, treating the expedition like a military campaign. They were going to expose the fraud, or kill the ghost. As the wagon train approached the Bell property, the road was flat and dry. The horses were strong. Suddenly, just yards from the property line, the procession came to a violent halt. The wagon didn't hit a rock. It didn't lose a wheel. It simply stopped, as if it had hit an invisible wall of solid stone. The horses panicked. They dug their hooves into the dirt, straining against the harness, muscles trembling, froth flying from their mouths. But the wagon would not move an inch. Jackson, frustrated, cracked his whip. He shouted commands. The men got out and pushed. They checked the wheels. The axles were greased and free. There was no physical reason for the stoppage. For several minutes, the future President of the United States fought against physics. He was being humiliated. Finally, Jackson threw down his whip and reportedly said, "By the eternal boys, it must be the Bell Witch." At that exact moment, a metallic, cackling female voice erupted from the empty bushes beside the road. It was loud, sharp, and mocking. It said, "All right, General, let the wagon move. I will see you again tonight." Instantly, the invisible weight lifted. The horses lurched forward, almost knocking the men over. The wagon rolled smoothly, as if nothing had happened. Jackson had been welcomed, but on the entity's terms. The group arrived at the farmhouse and set up camp. That night, the house was packed. The Bell family, neighbors, and Jackson's men gathered in the main room by the fire. Jackson wanted to see the phenomenon. One of Jackson's men, a self-proclaimed witch tamer, began to boast. He was a large man, armed with a pistol, loaded with a silver bullet, the folklore cure for supernatural evil. He strutted around the room, making fun of the Bell family, claiming that ghosts were only afraid of brave men. He shouted at the ceiling, daring the witch to show herself so he could shoot her. He said, "This thing won't bother me. I've got a silver bullet for her." The silence that followed was heavy. Then the candle went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, the soldier screamed. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a scream of agony. The other men heard the distinct sounds of a physical beating, punches landing on flesh, clothes being ripped, and the man groaning. He was being tossed around the room like a rag doll. The voice of the witch boomed in the darkness. "I'll teach you to brag." Then the door flew open. The witch tamer was physically lifted off his feet by an invisible force and thrown out the front door into the dirt yard. The door slammed shut behind him. When the candles were relit, the man was gone. He had fled into the night, leaving his silver bullet behind. Andrew Jackson watched all of this in silence. He had faced the British Army. He had faced Creek warriors. But he had no weapon for this. The entity then turned its attention to Jackson. It spoke to him, revealing details about his past, details about his military career that no one in that room could possibly know. It exposed fraud in his own unit. It dismantled his skepticism with information. The next morning, the Bell family woke up to find the camp empty. Andrew Jackson and his men had packed up and left before dawn. They were seen heading back to Nashville. When asked later about the incident, Jackson famously replied, "I would rather fight the British fleet at New Orleans than face the Bell Witch. This event is crucial to the legend. It validates the story historically. If it were just a farmer telling ghost stories, we could dismiss it. But when a general, a man who would become the face of the 20 Billions, away in terror, we have to accept that something profound happened on that land. But the humiliation of the general was just a game for Kate. Her real work was the destruction of John Bell. As the years passed, the assaults on his body became systemic. The entity wasn't just slapping him anymore, she was poisoning him. By the winter of 1820, John Bell was a shadow of the man he once was. The entity had systematically dismantled him. The once strong farmer, who had cleared acres of land with his own hands, was now bedridden. His tongue was perpetually swollen, making speech difficult. His facial muscles twitched uncontrollably, a condition the entity mocked relentlessly. Whenever John Bell would walk through his fields, the entity would follow him, screaming insults from the trees, calling him Old Jack, and predicting his imminent death. She would say, "I have you where I want you now, Old Jack. You won't last the winter." On the morning of December 19th, 1820, John Bell failed to wake up. He lay in his bed in a deep, unnatural stupor. His breathing was heavy and ragged. His family tried to rouse him, but he was unresponsive. When they went to the medicine cupboard to retrieve his usual tonics, they found something that did not belong there. Sitting on the shelf, where his medicine should have been, was a strange, small vial. It contained a dark, smoky liquid that no one in the family recognized. Dr. George, the local physician who had been attending to the family, was summoned immediately. He examined the vial. He uncorked it and smelled the contents. The odor was pungent and unrecognizable. It wasn't laudanum. It wasn't whiskey. It was something chemical and foul. As the doctor held the vial up to the light, the voice of the witch erupted in the room. It was triumphant. She cackled, "It's useless for you to try to relieve Old Jack. I have got him this time. I gave him a big dose of that out of the vial last night, and that fixed him." Dr. George, a man of science, needed proof. He needed to know if the liquid was indeed poison or just another trick. He called for the family cat. He took a straw, dipped it into the dark liquid, and wiped a small amount onto the cat's tongue. The reaction was immediate and violent. The animal went into convulsions. It leaped into the air, spun around in agony, and collapsed on the floor, dead. The toxicity of the substance was absolute. John Bell had ingested a fatal dose. The family watched in horror as the patriarch took his final breaths. On the morning of December 20th, 1820, John Bell died. The entity finally fell silent, but the disrespect did not end with his death. The funeral of John Bell was one of the largest gatherings in the history of Robertson County. Hundreds of people came from miles around, some to mourn, but many out of morbid curiosity to see if the witch would appear. As the coffin was carried out of the house and loaded onto the wagon for the procession to the graveyard, the air was filled with a sound. It wasn't the wind, it was singing. Floating above the funeral procession, loud and clear, was the voice of Kate. She wasn't singing a hymn. She wasn't singing a dirge. She was singing a rowdy, bawdy drinking song called "Row Me Up Some Brandy." Oh, she sang it with joy. She laughed between the verses. As the family lowered John Bell into the frozen earth, the entity serenaded them with insults and mockery. She continued to sing until the last shovel of dirt was placed on the grave. Then, she said, "Go home now. I am finished here." With John Bell dead, the entity's mission seemed complete. The violence in the house subsided. But before she left, she had one final conversation with the family. She told them she was leaving, but she made a promise. She said she would return in 7 years. True to her word, in 1828, she returned. But this time, she didn't come to torture. She came to talk. She appeared to John Bell Jr. and engaged in long philosophical conversations with him. During these visits, she made prophecies that defied explanation. She predicted the American Civil War 33 years before it happened. She described the carnage, the freeing of the slaves, and the economic collapse of the South. She spoke of iron monsters traveling on rails and machines that would fly in the sky. After these revelations, she bid farewell again, promising to return in 107 years, in 1935. Did she return in 1935? The records are scarce. Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, a descendant of the family, wrote a book about the haunting that year. But shortly after, he died of a mysterious heart attack. Locals believe that was her sign. Today, the Bell farmhouse is long gone. The land has been subdivided, but one feature remains, the Bell Witch Cave. Located on the bluffs of the Red River, the cave is a place of heavy, oppressive energy. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but the Department of the Interior doesn't list the reasons why locals avoid it. Visitors who enter the cave today report camera malfunctions, batteries draining instantly, and the sensation of being choked. There are photos taken by tourists that show misty shapes hovering over the water inside the cavern. Some claim to see the face of an old woman forming in the rock. But the most terrifying reports come from those who challenge the legend. People who mock the witch inside the cave often leave with physical marks, 3 distinct scratches running down their arms or backs, burning as if they were made by hot iron. The Bell Witch haunting remains America's most disturbing ghost story, because it has an ending that we don't like. The good guys didn't win. The priest didn't banish the demon. The skepticism of the general didn't stop the supernatural. The witch won. She killed her target. She mocked his grave. And she left on her own terms, leaving a scar on the Appalachians that has never healed.